I believe we are live now. So hello, guests. Hi, everybody here. I'm Kyle Cordes at Oasis Digital. Everybody else want to introduce?
I can go first. I'm Zachary Kipping, just a software developer and Angular Bootcamp instructor with Oasis Digital.
I'm Lance Finney, also a developer with Oasis Digital and an instructor with Angular Bootcamp.
Paul Spears, architect and developer over at Oasis Digital as well.
Great. So we're all the same place, in case anyone missed it. So I guess our usual agenda here is we just kind of talk about what's going on in front-end full stack dev world this week. So what's going on?
One thing that I just posted in internal chat in our company is a link from Minko Getchev of the Angular team that apparently in Angular 12, they're going to turn up the knobs for strictness for default, which I think is kind of cool. The project I'm on, we already have the knobs turned about as far as we can, and it does cause some pain, but it's better to start with that than to come to it later. The one that I think we would probably on my current project have some trouble with is they're also going to make the budget for the download bundle size a little bit smaller. And that might cause us some concern with the libraries we have. But personally, I'm looking forward to it.
I think for projects that we start, we normally here, turn the strict up as far as it can reasonably go. But of course, more often we're helping our big corporate enterprise customer projects out, which have usually a significant amount of code before we arrive. And getting those to up and running with strict does not sound like a lot of fun. So do you think that once it's default, it'll be easier to get corporate customers to turn up the knobs?
Personally, I think that there's always some entropy, and if the initial starting point is stricter, then you have to justify making things less strict, and that'll be a conversation. Like there's always fewer conversations about staying with the defaults than there is to switch to something else.
100%.
Yeah, that makes sense. I think with our client project, it's just, since we have so many people on it, having just stricter stuff out of the box from the get-go will just make everything a little more clean with our PRs and doing reviews. Because we always have like random things where it's like, oh, there's this, you should probably swap it. You're not getting any linting warnings just because things aren't as strict. But as long as we can keep ramping it up, it makes things a little cleaner.
Yeah, I've kind of found as a kind of a counterpoint to what Lance had said is that if those defaults that you have in place, if those are too obstructive, then people are also more likely to kind of jump ship entirely to another kind of technology as well, though.
That's fair.
Like a lot of folks will like conflate the strictness of the default TypeScript setting to like this is how hard it is to do Angular if they're not familiar with those benefits. And so I think that's a conversation that could be had a lot of times to help folks realize, no, this is a knob you can turn, and it does provide value in this default position. It's like, don't give up if that's a barrier for you.
Right, it's kind of what you get out of the box with TypeScript versus Angular, and like the same principles with TypeScript apply to the other like React or Vue or anything like that that's using TypeScript as well. It's just another hurdle along with the learning curve of Angular.
So some of you have spent some time in some of these other ecosystems, either different front end libraries, frameworks, or even server side. And my impression is that overall, Angular's kind of leading the way of getting more of this stuff in by default. I know that when I've picked up off-the-shelf sort of kits for doing TypeScript with some of the other popular choices out there, which I otherwise like, it's not yet popular for these kits to have particularly strict TypeScript defaults. So hopefully we'll see this spread across the industry as so many other things have.
Yeah, I think that kind of comes from the point of the Angular team themselves are doing the TypeScripting, like the strict typing of their own like underlying code and under the hood code. So kind of just as long as they're upgrading their stuff and going with the latest and greatest and strict stuff, we'll probably get that too on our project as well. So
yeah.
So and if you look at the blog post that I saw, Kyle just showed the link on, they say that Minko says that the Angular team polled the community and found that 70% of developers were already using strict. Now, he has another blog post that he links to talk about where they get their numbers from. So yeah, I don't know. I can't say if it's 70% of projects or developers or how that works. But if that's true, then this shouldn't be a big change for a lot of people. But it might be enough of a change for that 30% to bring in what Paul was worried about. But who knows? We'll see.
Cool. Well, I have another small topic for our kind of appetizer topics here. Yeah, I'm gonna post a URL in here. So at Oasis Digital here, we are hiring. So I always try to get the URL up there. We're both hiring a front end full stack, and we are potentially hiring a UI UX kind of role. So I don't know. This is hopefully long-lived content, and those may be long filled by the time anyone sees this. But I figured just in case anyone watches it soon, I'll get it up there on the screen. If anybody wants to say anything to scare off potential applicants about how terrible it is here, now's a good time. We have a beautiful office that we're only lightly using since 2020.
I only stepped in it like maybe twice last year. Yeah.
It's so nice. It's really nice. It's nicely really designed. It's shaped. It's nicely colored. Like everything about it is great. Someday we'll be collaborating in it all over extensively.
Yeah,
I assume that's the plan.
I think I spent more time in it while it was under construction than I have since it was completed almost a year ago.
Yeah, because we were all visiting like crazy during the construction. It was really great. But anyway, so I guess we're not able to use that. Go ahead.
Kind of enjoying my office to myself that I have right now.
True.
Because no one else is there. So no rush, guys. No rush.
I mean, I enjoy my home office.
I've gotten so used to my home office that most of the time it's like, yeah, it's fine. I don't really need it. But then every once in a while when I'm, talking with some people, I'm like, man, talking with people works a lot better when you're in a nice studio. But we'll get there. So what else?
As another side topic, we could also talk about some of the random Twitter links I found with just kind of pushing the boundaries with some of the framework stuff we can always do. So
take a look on those. You got a link to share I can put up on the screen for people?
I think I put it in the YouTube chat.
Yeah, you need to put it in the StreamYard here that we use to produce this. If you throw it in there, then I can put it up on the screen.
Possibly there.
Well, the wrinkle is, I think if you go put it directly in the YouTube chat, it may eventually appear in the StreamYard chat. And this thing is set up where people viewing can chat at us, but when we put stuff, we ought to put it directly in there. There we go. I wish the preview had the contents of the tweet.
Right, yeah. But this one is mostly just kind of making use of Angular as like an actual backend server system. So like you literally do template stuff to render out a server, do like GET requests, do POST requests, all this kind of fun stuff. It's not meant for real use, but it is kind of neat just to see like pushing the boundaries. And someone even posted a comment of like, hey, there's something React did as well, kind of doing this. So it's kind of neat just to see both frameworks just literally pushing massive boundaries just for the sake of tech.
You're saying this is the one where it like you get to code an Angular server, or you get to code a server.
Literally, yeah, it's not like
Angular.
Nest. It's like an actual server within an Angular application. Yeah.
Yeah, that's wild. I'm looking at. Unfortunately, I need to juggle a couple things to be able to share this particular thing. Well, maybe I could find a way to make it work. But it basically makes like an Angular component that when that component is instantiated, I guess, it listens on a port. And so you just run Angular in Node, I guess, to be able to make that work. And the magic happens.
That's an example. So basically it's like you have a server element, and then you have like your get, post, put, like your CRUD operation elements. And then you put a URL as like an input, and then you usually have some type of directive that kind of maps to like a Nest controller. So it's kind of interesting.
Here we go.
Yeah,
I managed to get it to share on for any viewer to see.
And then that GitHub repo shows like some.
So if I just click into that repo,
now
it
has an example up.
That's interesting. If I could, I need to navigate the existing tab to the new place. So So you're saying if I scroll down, there we go. Yeah, that's. I just wanted to see this, have this code up on here.
Yeah, and if you actually look at the example app too, like scrolling up a little bit, you can see like how they implement the SumController, which is mostly like the custom code there. So the sandbox app.
Just tell me where it is. I don't.
Yeah, and the sandbox app and the source.
I don't want to take people on.
And then the SumController Directive all the way at the bottom. So like that's the code you would actually instantiate, saying like, hey, when this port gets hit or this URL, this endpoint gets hit, do this stuff. So kind of neat. Making use of some DI stuff.
So, So are the routes then defined? Like, because there's nothing about a route in there.
Yeah, so the routes are defined in the actual template. Like you can actually see it down there below, down in that README. So you have a get element. So you have a get element and then a URL. Yeah. Basically specify your endpoints and then what controllers they map to with directives.
I mean, I assume this is not like intended for real use,
this
right?
This is more just like it's an experiment, kind of pushing the boundaries, and it was kind of cool to see a couple people comment like, "Hey, you can do the same exact thing like other frameworks as well." So, that's the versatility of everything. Like, it's kind of neat.
That's something I had noticed, and some people say Nest has a lot in common with Angular, and I think it does have the DI system in common.
Yeah.
But like, it doesn't really choose to do anything in markup. Like markup is sort of totally optional if you want to render some front-end markup, whereas Angular can like manage component lifetimes and so on using markup. It's just interesting to see somebody taking this highly alternative approach. I'm thinking that's unlikely to gain any widespread adoption.
I hope not. No one should ever use that in production, probably.
Yeah,
but it was kind of neat to see.
Yeah,
cool.
I think I want to do one of those and then just called my controller my Nest controller just to confuse everyone.
There you go.
Very nice. So trying to think what we've had. Oh, here's a recent one. Zachary, you just presented to I don't know, several dozen live audience, and who knows how many more since then on NGRX.
Yep.
So Mike, I didn't ask super hard questions. I wanted to leave it to like the actual audience, but maybe I'll ask you some super hard questions in our smaller group for the in crowd here who
sure.
who watches this. So like, what is your criteria when you're looking at a project for deciding whether you want to reach for NGRX or not?
That's a good question. For me, it's mostly about how much shared state between components, between views, between like separate like borderline entities or features inside your application that can't be handled with like routing, can't be handled with forms, can't be handled with basic like inputs, outputs between components. And then also just like, I don't want to go too deep in services because like once I start reaching for behavior subjects and managing my own state, if it gets too complicated too fast, then I might reach for NGRX. That's for my own side of things. But it also kind of depends on the scaling of the team and organization too, where sometimes I might trade off a little bit of like doing stuff myself and kind of knowing how everything works with the services for having more of like a consistent API with NGRX just to make the rest of the like ecosystem of the project a little bit easier for everyone else to use, because not everyone's a me, right? Like I consider myself relatively expertise at like RxJS and stuff like that, not to bloat, but not to gloat, sorry. But yeah, so like just having a more consistent API, it's a little bit more straightforward to use. Helps out. And
Lance just presented this link. So this is the official answer. So what is the official answer, Lance? Can you TLDR it for us?
Yeah, well, Sherry is an acronym. It's you should, according to the NGRX team. So there's obviously bias that you may or may want to discount.
Probably.
You should use NGRX, or at least consider using it, if your state is shared, needs to be hydrated, needs to be available, needs to be retrieved, and it is impacted by actions from other sources. And if you follow that link, they break down, go into more detail about what each of those mean. So the interesting thing I think with the NGRX team is they will very clearly say not every they have a hammer, but not everything is a nail, and you shouldn't always use it. The other thing about this is I always wondered why they called it Sherry, because you can also use those to create the acronym HAIRS, which is actually an English word.
I like that better.
But then I found out that one of the members of the NGRX team, or a friend of members of the NGRX team, is named Sherry. So like they named this after her. So So that's where that kind of backronym came from.
So Paul, as the official Angular for Architects lead instructor, who should know the answer, what are we missing? What is the true answer to whether NGRX is right for my project?
Well, what I typically tell students is the primary motivating factor for using NGRX has nothing to do with the API or what kind of features you have or how it affects your application at all. For me, it is the fact that it is presenting a unified, consistent API for dealing with state across features and applications, and at the scale of organization, where it will make your team members and the folks that you're looking to hire more interchangeable as there's a need to move them around between projects. You can kind of count on the developer that you put on that new feature or new app to be able to figure out what kind of state management technique is going on and how to trace through that feature without any additional training, provided they're all trained in NGRX. And so to me, it is about the fact that it provides that unified API, and what that buys you more than it is, maybe NGRX is better than observable, manual observables that feature X, or maybe just a good form group is better. Like, that's not really what it's about for me when we're talking about enterprise apps. Interestingly enough, I have a use case that I don't think fits into the Sherry principle, and as someone who like looks for an opportunity to use things other than NGRX, this one's kind of weird, where I would actually go out and use this right away. And the use case I give an example of is I have a kind of like a web canvas editor, like that the user can interact with to do things like put some font on a screen, rotate it, scale it, change the color, and make a kind of a flashy banner, and then save the output of that WYSIWYG like experience. And we needed to connect that to a broader Angular app. Well, just the sheer collections of actions that a user could take against this canvas, we needed to actually have it stored and managed somewhere. And just by nature of the volume of things that you could do, like any other state management pattern would require us to essentially recreate NGRX. So it was almost like by virtue of volume alone, which is not really any of the principles listed in the Sherry principle. And so sheer volume within a single feature and needing to manage that state can also drive you to NGRX as a good solution.
So I heard about complexity. If you have a lot of complexity, you probably should be looking there. But then I also heard, maybe even more interesting, that you're saying that maybe that decision is probably being made at broader than just the level of a single project.
Right.
To create a commonality. That's pretty cool. It did not occur to me at all. Nice. Well, any more on NGRX before we jump into our main topic as advertised of the day? So it's on the tin. We wanted to talk about kind of the general idea of Angular for designers. This idea had been floating around. I think Stephen Fluin had been promoting it pretty heavily a few years ago. And the thought of maybe some special tooling coming out. I don't know that any special tooling ever came out, but I know it's like a topic that comes up like in our enterprise customer projects somewhat regularly, is basically how do we take the work product, the designs created by designers, and get them into our Angular project? Do designers work over in isolation, just throw something over a wall? Or do designers actually work in the Angular project on some kinds of components? And I thought we should kind of go around the roundtable here and talk about what kind of things we've seen of solutions and things that customers have done, and maybe we can go back and forth and come up with some ideas that people with this category of problems should think about.
Yeah, so maybe I can chime in first. So my current project is making use of like an entire design system team. So like we have our UX team, and then we also have like our actual UI team as well. And they use mostly a thing called like Figma. So it's kind of just like a SketchUp thing where you can kind of make HTML-like stuff and kind of have like a CSS output. So thankfully, a lot of our designers know and understand CSS to an extent of like knowing like rim units, knowing like kind of like the base stuff for getting things set up. Just recently learned about like grids and float or like flex boxes and stuff like that. So they don't know everything, but they know enough that it gives us meaningful CSS we can use. And for our project, we mostly make use of like a more of a traditional style CSS approach, or a SAS approach really. So we have more global cascading style sheets, like what it's intended to be from a web front. And because of that, we can kind of just let our design team, if they want to, a lot of times we'll just do a little bit of the work for them to transfer from Figma to our actual design system or component library. But if they want to, they can go into the actual style sheets for different themes, for different components and things like that, and actually just straight up plug the styles in, like padding, colors, all that good stuff. And then anything that is kind of integral to the component, like for example, I've been making a table recently, and the table is a table, but it also has like a top action bar and like a footer action bar. And kind of displaying those things optionally using CSS grid was something I put in the component styles, because it's kind of for the function of the component itself versus like the colors and the padding and the theming of the table, and the actual action bars are more global styles. So that's kind of how we've been going with it. It's been working really well so far. The design team seems pretty happy with it because we can integrate things pretty easily. Stuff can be overwritten very easily, depending on situations and themes and stuff.
So, okay, so it sounds like in your workflow on your project you're talking about, that the designers are working with tools at the visual level, but also working with HTML, CSS, but aren't actually working in the Angular.
Right. I mean, they have like gone to the repo and done some tweaks to some of the CSS themselves. But a lot of times, since they're kind of still in more of the design phase, a lot of their stuff isn't concrete fully yet. So we've been kind of transferring some themes and colors over just to get something to look good for application. But yeah, they've mostly been chilling in Figma.
Right. So
like
okay. So in this model, they are the designer group is like aware of the Angular components,
right,
and is maybe occasionally editing the CSS, but
right,
isn't really working in Angular. Is that
exactly? Yeah. So they're not actually design. They're like not making components. They're aware of the functionality of the components and like how the design impacts that.
And
but,
I really feel like that's kind of historically kind of the main approach of a design system that comes close to, but rarely actually steps into and actually edits the components.
Right. I think eventually we might have a team that is more dedicated, like an in-between, that is more dedicated to actually implementing the designs if the designers need that, just to take away from some of the other people that are doing more high-level architectural stuff. But yeah, so we might eventually have kind of like a more full idea of actual designers and actual people like implementing and working very, very closely with the designers to make the components. But for now, like the designers themselves are mostly just on the Figma side and occasionally tweaking things.
So is there any consideration of actually teaching the designers some amount of Angular?
Kind of. I think to the extent of them knowing where the stuff is, we've kind of taught them. We've also taught them some other stuff like CSS grid and Flexbox and stuff like that, just to kind of get them more incorporated of how we kind of place things and move things and stuff like that. But I don't think they specifically need to know everything about Angular. They kind of know how components work. We kind of explained how like we have component styles and also global styles. We explained that whole system and how everything kind of integrates, and how global styles are kind of an easier way to go about things because we're about to go a different path. But just so we don't have to overwrite component styles and whatnot constantly, depending on situations and themes and etc. So, but yeah, we haven't taught them like all of Angular, and I don't think there's a need necessarily, nor do I think they actually want to. They just kind of want to focus on the design stuff and kind of hand it off a little bit, but that's just our designers. So,
Lance or Paul, what have you seen?
Go ahead.
Yeah, so similar, kind of pretty similar to what Zachary was saying. The project that we've had kind of the most design iteration and design integration had a standalone third-party organization doing the UI UX for the platform that we were working on, and they were doing that in Adobe XD. And we were working with them to try and figure out, okay, how are we going to marry this together? And we were actually brought in to advise on how do we marry the two organizations' work effort and product into a single path, because we had on one side we had our client, which was strictly development firm, that like their view of the world was in like source control, change revision tracking, having the artifacts as human readable file formats that live right inside a repository. And we had the design team, which like they had a workspace that was part of a file that you saved inside of a design tool that had revision tracking in the design tool. And even like the philosophies of work were fundamentally different. And we had to like start with like a shared understanding of what those two philosophies were before we could even talk about code. And at the end of the day, where we landed was, hey, let's just let the designers be designers, the developers be developers, and as such, the actual translation of design to code like fell to the job of the designers, or sorry, to the developers who authored out some CSS. And so, despite having a design team, the design work as it lives in Angular was being done by developers. If that makes sense.
Yeah, and I don't have any stories that are quite as comprehensive as what Zachary does. Last year I was working for a client that was a very large company, and they had external design principles that we were supposed to follow, and they had another team within the company that was creating components that we were supposed to use, but they weren't really Angular components, so we hadn't quite figured out how to make that match. So that probably, as that team has matured since I left the team, I'm guessing that they have done more with that and have become more integrated with their designers, but we didn't really have much. On the project I'm on right now, the company doesn't really do many web apps, and so we're kind of on our own in terms of figuring out what the design is. They do have some principles that come from their corporate parent company, and so this color green and that color red or whatever. But other than that, it's kind of up to us. But what we are finding is that we're having trouble with the interaction with the client of finding out what they want from us. And so we're starting to work with them to bring in Adobe XD just to have a shared language to bring information from the users who don't really know much about web, and from us who don't know that much about their product. And so we're starting to build Adobe XD as a common tongue, but it's not exactly the design approach that we use. It may be that we're just getting general ideas there, but we're not actually going to be doing pixel perfect anything in XD. So kind of in between.
So more broadly, like not inside the level of a single project, over I don't know how many years we've been doing a lot of training various types around front end. There has very often been a question when companies are starting down the path. And of course, today in 2021, almost everybody is already down the path. But in 1997, a smaller percentage. There's still a lot of almost every company would have been well down the path. But there are many projects and many teams inside companies that were closer to the beginning of their journey on sort of web front ends of all kinds. And we've very often had discussions about, should I include my designers in my training for my web framework? And I think at the time, and probably ever since, we generally give the advice, yes, send a few people, because the more shared understanding, like even if the designers are not typing Angular code, the more shared understanding there is of like kind of the reality of the components that will be behind the scenes based on the mock-up or the spec that was created, then the more closely the teams can really work together. I don't know that I've ever seen the boundary move to where developers are like coding the view layer Angular components. I know that I've heard that idea talked about quite a bit at conferences on Twitter and other places, but I don't know that I've ever actually seen that like in a real project, where we were in the team looking at the code. I've heard rumors. Has anybody else here heard of anybody actually taking that step all the way and like having their designers write the view layer components?
Go ahead, Zach.
I think our project, just bringing it back to my project again, I guess, but we had kind of talks about it because like we specifically weren't brought on necessarily to kind of do like build a component library kind of thing, right? We were doing more upper level architectural stuff, doing stuff in X and all that good stuff. We ended up taking on the component library just because, but our original ideas were possibly bringing in the designers and letting them just crank out some HTML and all the Sass and stuff like that. And if we needed to, we could go back in, actually set up the actual TypeScript for the component and add a little bit of code here and there for the events and making things like just making more generic components if need be as well. Because a lot of times when you have a component library that's with Angular, it's not just a simple, I plop down an element and I get some stuff. There's usually inputs, usually outputs, usually more config to make something that's more reusable and actually a good API for the developer to use as well. And since we brought that in, it was just, there was so much custom code we would need to write anyways for a lot of the components that it just felt, as long as we have good discussions and design team and us are actually meeting up, talking about things, having an iterative process on the design and the way the components work, and kind of a mutual understanding of that, we felt that we might as well just throw down the template and CSS ourselves, because a lot of times it's almost like a copy paste. We use all the same verbiage for the Sass variables for colors, a lot of the same stuff for rims and all this kind of stuff. So it was kind of an easy way for us to translate from the Figma per se to the stuff. So we didn't feel like we needed to bring them the whole 9 yards into the project. It kind of just worked out that way, thankfully. And ironically, I've actually kind of enjoyed doing the Sass side just from the global perspective, which is kind of a fresh take for once, actually doing some design work.
Yeah, there's this idea of like the unicorn developer that knows how to do like the design, the CSS, the front end, the back end, and there's a similar version from the developer's perspective, like looking for the perfect designer. Like they're looking for that designer who happens to have worked in HTML, CSS, and enough JavaScript framework world to kind of understand the impact that the component-based web structure, how that actually impacts and affects the actual technical requirements of how CSS must be shaped in order to design a component-based application. And I think that's a similar idea. Like, yeah, you're not going to find a designer who is that good at designing, who also knows the deep intricacies of the HTML structure of a web app. Just as I am not going to be that good at design, even though I do know that how to structure the web app. The key challenge with the client I was talking about was that we started down the path of saying, hey, let's have the designers try and ship us some CSS that we'll kind of use as the starting point that we build our component design system on. And what we found was that the base level understanding of CSS, and they were applying a BEM architecture to the CSS, which, if you're not familiar, it's BEM stands for block element modifier, and it describes the DOM structure that must be in place in order to take advantage of the elements that get modified. That's your block element modifier. And that approach, kind of out of the box, if you drive from the perspective of CSS, you're going to find that you can't make your Angular components both be functional and have the structure that the CSS prescribes. And we're at an impasse where the CSS that we were receiving was basically not usable. And we just could not get one person that knew how to do both jobs.
Yeah, that's a fair point. I think from our side, I think we were lucky enough just to find designers that knew CSS enough to actually give us right? We still have like little elements on the screen. They have like their padding and stuff, but that's enough. Like, give me that, and I can take my limited knowledge of design and CSS and like all that good stuff and kind of translate that. Like Paul was saying, like you can take that, like the CSS they handed you, and actually translate that into something that works with Angular and like the design patterns you're taking, whether it's global styles or component styles or whatever.
So this tension is not new. I experienced this tension in approximately the year 2000, which checking my calendar here, that's 21 years ago. So the web was much earlier days then, and browsers worked much less well and so on. But I was at an organization where we had, I mean, maybe not quite shouting matches, but definitely, accusations of other groups that wouldn't stay in their lane, that kind of thing. Really serious organizational strain, because there was a design group that was saying, here's the appearance it should have, and here is the HTML it should have, and here is the CSS. Don't change any of the CSS. Don't change the appearance, and just make your program emit the HTML the way this is shaped. And I was kind of in a position of having to somewhat arbitrate between these groups, because I was sort of a hired gun whose job was to figure out whatever they were stuck on. And yeah, I mean, just the unfortunate reality is that HTML and CSS, which makes a perfect static state mockup, you often just cannot use that exact HTML structure and get a working, reasonably functional result. This predates Angular by many years, of course, but the principle still applies. So I think that so basically, if you're going to have the arm's length relationship, I think inevitably, even if some HTML and CSS and Sass come flowing over, it's going to have to be a back and forth, to get a working result.
Yeah, definitely. We even use something called Storybook. Actually had some recent public events for it. So that's kind of where we kind of post what we thought the implementation details of their Sass that they gave us should look like. The designers can pop in, kind of play with it a little bit, analyze the CSS and tweak them things pixel by pixel. And like, hey, we saw it, we iterated on it. Here's where we think you can make improvements based on what we saw in Storybook. We implement those, and it's kind of a good revolving system. We rely on Figma, they rely on Storybook, and we can kind of go back and forth and just talk.
That's a really interesting idea. I hadn't even thought about that. We typically think of it as, Figma's the contract we have with which to communicate back and forth, but it's really a one-way relationship where the designers, they can, mock things up and send it to the developers, but the developers are speaking a different language. And like, even if they can use the tool to like write comments and leave feedback and even go in and adjust things in Figma themselves, like they're doing it in a language that is not the one they're implementing. And so it kind of doesn't allow that equal feedback of, hey, here's my attempt of making it real. Can you leave your feedback in my tool? I think it's an interesting way of viewing Storybook.
Yeah, to even go even further, we actually like made our own little custom thing with Storybook where they can see the Figma. Like we handed a link that throws up an iframe that shows the Figma element and the component.
Cool.
It keeps us a little bit more honest, where it's like, hey, this is what it should look like in the white or the light theme, the dark theme, etc. And
like
then
you get them side by side, right? Like
because we have a lot of stuff. We have like tables that have dark theme, light themes, accents, various different modes or whatever. So
let me see if I understand this right, because it sounds pretty cool. So you're saying you use Storybook to illustrate your various components in various states.
Right, just as like kind of like docs as well, just because developers need it too when they're making their products and stuff like that.
And then you added a little bit of static whatever to your Storybook display, so that when I saw the thing in the certain state, you just literally show the Figma mockup or Figma spec that had been built from next to it. So they're like these two, and then like these two, then like so you could just
like our first
flip
page,
through and
like our first page shows the Figma. You can kind of scroll through that. It syncs with our theming, so we have another plugin that does theming for the entire Storybook that syncs in with our global styles, which is kind of nice. And then you see the Figma. You can go straight into the docs, kind of compare it, see like, hey, this is what we resulted in with like whether the accent table or the dark theme table or light theme table, and then kind of compare and contrast real quick with the Figma without even having to change apps, change tabs, whatever. So
that's great. we should do that for all the customers. If you're one of our customers watching this and we're not doing this for you, you should ask. that's a really great use of the tools. That's fantastic.
I want one now.
Yeah, I know. I was just thinking, I kind of want one of those.
I think we pretty much hammered out the system enough that we could probably re-implement it now.
So I've got a pivot on this topic. Before I take it, I don't know if I've given Lance enough time. Lance, you got anything more to add?
No, I don't think so.
Okay, so
well,
we'll turn it up a notch. I don't think we've talked about any of this Angular for Designers idea in the context of design systems yet. My experience is most heavily with Angular Material, which is both an implementation and a design system. But my impression from digging into that somewhat deeply, not as deeply as Paul, who's probably going to tell me I'm wrong, is that there are just highly numerous details of how material design work and how Angular Material work that require just extensive back and forth adjusting between the design system spec and the Angular implementation to get everything right. There are just many, many little details that inevitably you end up having to be like that. Basically, that the people working on Angular Material, they must be 3/4 developer, 1/4 designer, or something like that. Is that? Am I off the track here, Paul?
No, I don't think so. I think you can probably get by with, leaning more heavily on the actual implementation side of things, and less the designer when you're talking about like building something out like this. Because typically, I think my experience is that you still find that there are still two teams. There's still the design team and the implementation team, and so, like, in my opinion, from what I've experienced, is that it's oftentimes, especially in enterprise, you get the same two teams that are responsible for app level design and implementation are also the same two teams doing the design system as well.
Are we talking about the design and implementation of the design system, or the design and implementation of the design system, or the design and implementation of the application? Because it seems like there's almost like 6 different slots that one could land in.
Yeah, so I've seen. So I'm going to try that again. The different slots there. So you've got the design system itself that needs to be built out. You've got the app itself that needs to be built out, and then there is like a design process that you have to undergo where you take the design system and you have to figure out how to utilize it and put the individual units together to actually make the app from that design system. And kind of depending upon just how big the org is, and crazy things like, you could have a design system that is part of an organization that spans 20 different teams and thousands of developers, and you may not even have any kind of relationship with people who built the design system. And so, like, kind of where you're at on that spectrum, you might be the people who are making the app and the design system, or you might have no say whatsoever in the process. So it's all over the place. And so, to tie it back to Angular, I kind of see it as fundamental as the fact that Angular has kind of two facets to it. There's Angular as a library author, and then there's like Angular as an app author. And depending upon your situation, you might need to wear both hats, and you might have to use both sides of Angular. But yeah, it's all over the board. And from what I've seen, typically the most common is that there is a design team and there is an implementation team, and for all of those tasks, they kind of remain in their own lane of design or implementation. Sorry if that didn't answer the question. This is kind of how I frame it.
So as far as I can tell, so far, really none of us are all that sold on the idea that you should go get your designers and make them learn a subset of Angular and have them code the components.
So it might sound that way.
Okay.
But the thing that I think is most beneficial to that, I think you should have like one or two of your lead designers go learn Angular. Because at the end of the day, like in order to stay in your lane, you need to know what your lane looks like. And you need to know what the other guy's lane looks like. You need to be able to see the line between it and understand when one lane has to cross over the other. You know, it's a silly analogy, but it's true. You know, that core problem I was describing earlier of, you know, not being able to use the design team CSS because they had this the fundamental misunderstanding of the architecture of the structural differences of plain static HTML versus an app. You know, they wasted tons of time and effort because of that, because they didn't know enough about Angular to know what those kinds of barriers and blockers would be.
Also, to expand on that, from our side, like our designers aren't as far as much, like they know everything about Angular, but they know enough from just talking to us and being with meetings with us that they can kind of not warp, but kind of change their view on how they design some of the stuff, because they design from features as well, like feature functionality of components and things like that we're putting into our implementation. So certain things like a table having header bars and footer bars that need to be like they can have any content inside of them. They need to be able to understand like kind of the way that works a little bit, using like Angular's content projection and like context switching and things like that. Not like super deep. They don't need to be in the weeds because that stuff is complicated, but they need to know a little bit of the limitations and things like that. What can be done, what's possible, and then because that's going to impact their design too. Because like if certain things just don't work, they wasted all that time on that design system. So it gives them at least a little bit more of a feasible approach when they come into design components, design the functionality.
Yeah, that's a great point. Yeah, I actually earlier this week went into a meeting, same client, and we were reviewing a most recent design, and we had the designers and the product owners like brainstorming over like how the features and functionality of the page should work, like Zachary's describing. And I had to like throw up the stop sign, say, hey, whoa, hang on a second here. We're talking about an MVP, a first release, like all of these little niceties about how, oh, this needs to do an inline search over, you know, thousands of records, and it needs to be paginated. It needs to have like all of these bits here. And it was basically like a completely custom table implementation with a tile view of that table. And I'm like, hold up, hang on, whoa, you know, hit the brakes. Like you don't understand what you're asking for. And so let's talk about this a little bit. And like by the time we were done, we had to basically walk the designers through exactly what Zachary's describing of, hey, here's how that functionality comes to life. It isn't as simple for us as put a button on the screen and magically it works to achieve that end.
Yeah, especially when it comes into the front of like kind of dynamically showing things and removing things from the screen as well. For designers, it's like, oh, cool, we just don't display that under these certain situations. But that can be kind of hard to play out sometimes as well, just depending on the actual functionality and the way the component itself works as well. So.
And Kyle started this by asking, you know, essentially, should designers go through and learn Angular? And I think back to one particular private class that I taught where one of the students was a designer, and she was perhaps the best student in that class, like, you know, getting through the workshops quickest, understanding the concepts really well. I would love to work on a project with her. But I don't know if it's because she went through Angular. It's just she seemed really, really good at her job. And that included being able to pick up Angular, even though that wasn't exactly part of her official core skill set. So it's going to depend on the people.
Well, I think we've also this entire conversation been conflating the terms of like UI designer and UX engineer. Like those are as far apart as a front end developer and a back end developer.
Maybe farther. People might span between front and back end engineering more often than they span between implementing the UI UX versus designing the UI UX. In fact, I would say that in some organizations, I don't know the percentage, like there really is almost no such thing as like an intentional separate role of a UI designer. There's just sort of a, whatever somebody who wanted a feature sketched out kind of becomes the design, and then that gets implemented without ever really having like a design iteration, design review type phase. I think that for small projects that probably works out okay, but it's probably not a great idea at scale. So I had a couple things that I wrote a couple notes as they're being discussed. So I think Paul, you were talking about maybe, or Zachary, you were talking about the kind of rough edge between like the first draft of what someone designs and what can readily be implemented. And It occurred to me that there's two different layers at which that hits difficulty, and I'm curious what we think about both of them. The first one is Angular specific and annoying. Ever since Angular, I think version 2, something we lost from AngularJS. We didn't lose much. Angular 2 onward is just this enormous reinvention, improvement in almost every way. But one thing we lost is the ability to have a component that sort of disappears in the DOM. Whereas in Angular 2+, every component takes up a layer of DOM. And so if you have a design and you have a styling and you have something like a flex or a CSS grid that relies on direct adjacency of layers in the DOM, sometimes you hit a really irritating situation when you go and you divide that design into components and you find that you have this DOM layer that you just, no one asked for that DOM layer in doing the design. And I'm curious if anybody here has hit that and like what we know to help people with that. And then the second higher level question before we go around the horn here is so if you're implementing a system using a component set or design system implementation that you've already adopted, whether internal or external, if you let that constrain your application design, your app dev will go really fast. But if your app dev design does things that your tool set doesn't know how to do yet, there's kind of potentially unlimited cost and time in implementing that design. And the reason I mentioned both of these issues is I think they're both different versions of the same thing. One's like a micro level and one's a very macro level of if your design can be constrained by if your design can be constrained by the tool decisions you already made, you're probably going to have an easier, faster implementation than if your designs are sort of a completely arbitrary, completely open world, and then you just have to like somehow make it work. So what do we think about this? What have we seen?
I absolutely love this. I similar story with client, have design team, and the client was having a hard time kind of making up their mind about what direction they wanted to take their app development. And they liked the idea of how simplistic Angular material apps were in their implementation, and how easy it was to use Angular material to quickly create an app. But they had pressure from product owners to kind of have a more polished, slightly more custom experience. And this also strikes straight to the heart of like the UX versus the UI. And so I said, hey, I have an idea. Let's let the UI UX folks go crazy in their design tool. Let them do whatever they want. And what we're going to do is we're not going to take any styles from them. What we're going to do is we're going to take the UX that they come up with, and we're going to interpret it in the context of what's available with Angular material. That way we get the screen flows and the feature UI flows that are from the UX experts, but we're not trying to match the pixel perfect unbounded version that they've come up with. We're going to stick within the kit to implement the essence and the heart of what they're trying to communicate with their UX. And that has been working amazingly well. I think that is probably one of the most powerful combinations I have seen in terms of kind of being a multiplier of force for both a good app and a fast a quickly delivered app.
Yeah, and to expand on that front, I know our project, we kind of went a different path. So instead of using material as like the driving factor for kind of re-implementing what the designers did, we actually just had material by itself, and we did everything. We kind of made our component library with Angular material, which again is kind of just adding another boilerplate layer. But what that allowed us to do is whenever the product apps, because we do like a micro front-end type architecture, whenever the product apps actually like implement and use our component library, as the design team has come along, actually iterated and made their designs and kind of completed things, we could come in, take their designs, rip out the Angular material for whatever component, kind of re-implemented it with their design, do things a little bit more cleaner with the API, whatever. And then no one needs to do anything really different from the actual product side, really. Might be a few small tweaks, but realistically, the like surface level API layer, the component library stays the same. And you kind of just do a hot swap of the underlying like design system and all that good stuff. So.
Yeah, I'm just reminded of kind of the opposite of of what Paul said, where I was on a project where I wish people had done that. This was a long time ago when I worked with a different company, and they had contracted with some designer who came up with an idea of this is the way that you should do something. And it was just, all right, you have a list of things here and we want to put them in here and you can do any of them and we want to be able to just, move them into or out of these things. And so just the standard old thing of, all right, 2 different lists with buttons, with arrows back and forth. No. These people had decided that the wave of the future was, well, there's going to be up to 10 things. So we're going to have 10 drop downs. And so if you decided, you know what, I want to move the 9th thing to the 1st, you had to change all 9 along the way instead of just having arrows to go up and down. And we kept saying there are tools out of the box that do this, but somehow that other company had convinced the BA on the project that, no, this is the wave of the future and this is what everyone's going to be doing in 5 years. And we just couldn't argue them away from it. We couldn't say the tools that are in the box are good enough. Let's just use the simple paradigms. But
hey, developers are just as guilty of a version of that as designers are. Like, we can't simply write an HTTP call. Like, we must go and put 5 layers of abstraction between it and the actual button that fires it off. So
where do I file the complaint that I'm in this picture and don't like it?
Right. Well, and I say that because, like, with all the love in the world, like, one of the phrases that I've used to describe this problem is like, a developer is going to develop and a designer is going to design. Like, that's what they live for. For at least those that are like super passionate about what they're doing anyway. It's like, it's what they live for. Like, they want an opportunity to create something, and like, it's not a characteristic that's unique to designers, but living mostly on the development side, we kind of see that impact. Like, we are the ones directly downhill of the impact of that, whereas like either the infrastructure management team or the product owners are the ones that are directly downstream of us feeling our desire to create and do unique things. And so a lot of times we feel that the brunt of that from the design team most immediately.
And I think with our project, we gave our designers kind of like, since we're already using Angular material to implement the component library, we kind of gave them that base layer of focus, like, hey, this is kind of what we're using, this like the Google design, this kind of how it works. And they just use that as a base. Like, they were still able to iterate and go to town and do whatever the heck they wanted. But they still had that base commonality of like, it's pretty sleek, it's pretty whatever, it's kind of Google-ish. But they're able to go to town with colors, general design stuff, tweak things as much as they wanted. And eventually we kind of incorporate that, and it worked pretty well since we're already using like Angular material under the hood. So, but I think we're kind of thankful.
So along those same lines, I've been in some high level discussions of people trying to decide like what they're going to do in the large, like before getting to the small, but in the large. And I kind of wonder if you talk about this next one at all in our architects class. And that is, when you stand way back in your organization trying to decide what to do, that there is often some wisdom in just picking off-the-shelf default, quick and easy choices for as many things as you possibly can, while you start delivering actual value. Like you actually produce some business value or organizational value with your app. And then maybe in V2, you work on a more customized, local themed appearance. Just that idea of ship first, then iterate, versus have a longer initial dev cycle to work on, more fully including design.
Yeah, I got plenty of opinions on this. Anyone else want to go first?
Go ahead.
Okay. Yeah. So like there are so many different like nuanced paths, and again, like the right answer, you kind of called it out right at the beginning. The right answer is totally based upon just the world of constraints that your team lives in. Is this a situation where the team that's doing the app work, are they the ones also going to be like blazing the trail of making the design system for the rest of the organization? Is there already a design system in place somewhere and they're just choosing not to use it because they don't like it? Is there one that is in flight at the moment? Is there something off the shelf that folks have already used, but you don't want to use it because the product owner doesn't want to use it? And like all of those different scenarios kind of factor in when I'm making the decision. And one of the things that I've found is, like, regardless of any threats made by management or product owners or even the users, is that like working code and working apps, at the end of the day, they win. Like, code that works is almost never deleted. And so if you're on the app development team, in my opinion, that should be your number one priority. Even if you are the ones who are ultimately responsible for creating and birthing a design system component spec and shipping that up to the rest of the org, like, ship your app. And if that design system is still important enough, people will find iterations and time and budget for that to spin up and continue off of that original thrust of work. If you don't have a working app to implement your design system against, like, design system will be half-baked on top of it. So, like, get a working app. That's probably the most beneficial thing you can do.
I mean, to me, that reminds me of the idea that good frameworks and libraries usually emerge from working applications rather than being built speculatively. And I think that maybe applies to design system too. That's like a corollary of what you're saying, that a good design system should emerge from some good apps that successfully shipped.
Yeah, I'd say that's a fair way of describing it. Yeah, the clients that I've had who have successfully launched their design system have done so basing it off of existing prior works.
Yeah, and to that end, I know our client project, we did some of the bare minimum stuff we need, like buttons and stuff like that, all the good core stuff. But then past that, they just let the developers on the product apps do whatever they needed to do. If there's commonalities us for the PR reviewers saw, like progress bars and progress spinners and things like that people just really needed, we said, hey, designers, this is something we could probably use in the component lab or whatever. We're just going to do a base implementation of it, so everything's just good and going and everyone's fine. But we really like to get an actual good looking design out of this as well. So it keeps things moving, it keeps the actual app running and going smoothly, but then the design system can kind of crawl along as it needs to, and kind of catch up as well.
I want to express some appreciation. It really seems like on average, by and large, we have some pretty smart customers. So I just want to give a shout out to our customers who are, some might see this, that we appreciate that there are some sharp people making some great decisions. It's really, really great to work with.
Yeah, I'd say one of the on that same thought process, one of the decisions that my client made was the decision to have an outside firm do the design and in the UX, but not wed themselves to the actual pixel perfect product that they produce. Like, be willing to take what they have as inspiration rather than law, Like that's a rare thing. Like normally it's, hey, we paid for this, we're going to do it, is usually what I hear. And like, yes, but all the value isn't in the pixels, it's in the ideas and in the flow that came out of it, not the pixels themselves. And they were wise enough to recognize that and use it as that central conversation piece, and arbitrate where that work goes around the boundary because of that idea in a really healthy way.
Anything else on the shipping first idea? Because I have another one to throw out, but I'm sure we'll have some thoughts on. I don't want to step on anybody if you got anything more about this shipping first idea. Okay, so I wrote this down. I heard somebody say this word, but then it didn't get picked up in the conversation. It had to be 25 minutes ago at least. It was the word skinning. One of our sort of long-term irritations with, this is not Angular specific, just the way dev tools work, is like the decision to use a certain component set or a certain design system or something ends up being like strewn all over your application, right? It's like if you choose Angular material, almost every line of your component templates is going to have mat dash in it somewhere. If you're over in React and you choose the material UI implementation, then all of your React JSXs are going to be full of those components being thrown in. I kind of wish there was a way to like generically say, put in a button here, but somehow have the decision of what kind of button be either deferred or moved over to a different file or part of some configuration or something. So, some way that kind of all of the UI appearance and really even some of the behavior, if that could somehow be like a skin that's applied generically across the system rather than being hard-coded into 75,000 different lines of the template in my system have hard-coded in the choice of what component set, of what design system implementation we're using. I know that, this has been a topic of discussion kind of in unrecorded discussions around the headquarters for a number of years. But it occurs to me that like it's really pretty aligned to this Angular for Designers question. If it were possible to more fully separate the visual design from the application implementation, you can imagine like an application that an application team wrote and got working, and then some other build process tooling, whatever, that a group of designers use, and then those flow together downstream, and like they don't have to collaborate line by line because one is just like applied on top of the other, like when you deploy. And I remember there being applications that I actually worked on that had some of that, like back in the days. We had to go uphill 5 miles both ways in the snow to compile, but like I remember building applications with component sets where the component set was basically a skinnable component set, and so I would build with these very generic components, and then at runtime it could pick from 5 different, like radically different user experiences, like very, very different. Appearance, spacing, flow model could be very different. Is there anything like that in web technology today that we've seen, or has anybody been in a position with a project where you're like, we're using Angular material and we'd like to somehow in bulk switch to our internal design system? Like what can be done? Like where is the world on all this today?
So I guess from my side, the way we kind of solved that problem, because again, we had our design system, we also just wanted to get going. So we used Angular material. Our design there was, we already knew we were going to make a component library because we have a design system. There needs to be an implementation for that. So we just kind of wholesale wrapped Angular material in our own component library. and that allowed us to kind of do like that hot swapping that you're mentioning of like one release we're using a material, literally the next release we're using a design system. And then thankfully our design system itself is just robust enough that we can do different types of skinning, different types of theming of components and whatnot, depending on which situation they're in. If they're in this product app, if they're in that product app. Kind of our SaaS architecture there is robust enough that it kind of picks up on the different domains it's in, the different features it's in, and it kind of changes the theming a little bit.
So go ahead.
So to get theoretical here for a moment, I was foolish enough to like go down the route of trying to make a low-code platform for a while. And like basically what you're describing, Kyle, like the penultimate version of that is a low-code / no-code tool, where like what the actual thing that you do is you create a configuration specification, and then you supply it a kind of a template and desired like visual template for like how the app is supposed to be projected, and you end up then marrying the logic to a visual specification that you select. And so yeah, like things like that exist, but you know at that point you're talking about just a very like there's trade-offs. Like by the time you get that generic, you're basically talking about all the trade-offs of like moving to a low-code, no-code like platform. At the pinnacle of like that kind of functionality of, hey, it'd be nice if I could just kind of swap out these visual things. Well, if you have the dynamism in that visual layer, then you're going to have too much rigidity in the actual specifications of like what the app can do, and vice versa. Like the trade-off of functionality versus form is like right in your face.
So I'm trying to think of a concrete example of that. So for example, if one design system has a multi-column select drop down, and the other design system basically says, no, that doesn't exist, you should never do that, then like for your kind of generic layer, you'd have to decide whether or not that functionality exists, and it's going to be a really bad fit. Like it's gonna break things, at least in some partial way.
Here's one that you can go see today.
Okay.
If you dates versus date time pickers.
Mm.
Like Angular material does not have a date time picker, but you can go down the road and you can find like someone else's Angular component written to look like material that is a date time picker. And trying to move from like what can Angular material do versus another component set, like there's just like functionality gaps in whatever kind of generic thing you might try and implement.
Like mat table versus AG grid, kind of. There's a lot more. You can do a table with mat table, but if you want deep functionality, you need to go to AG grid. And AG grid has a material theme that's really close, but it's not exactly always the same.
I think I've seen that exact mismatch in real apps, and we're sort of like trying to figure out like we know we would like to make it perfect for our customer, but just the constraints of the system are it's either going to be missing some functionality or the material implementation is going to be a little off. In fact, I think you might have demoed that to me like last year, Lance. Huh. So, Paul, I think there's actually two different categories of that mismatch. Like for the date time picker, that one seems like a relatively benign one in that I don't think the Angular material or material design people like have a fundamental objection to there being date time pickers. They just haven't done one yet.
Yeah, there's an issue tracker for you.
Right, but I can also imagine trying to think of a good example of a case where, like, if one design system says, like, you should never do blah foo. There's some just thing that should not be done. We don't do that in our design system. Like, oh, here's one design system, like, always spaces things out very wide. Like that's like like every example they've ever made, every spec, every Figma, every Adobe XD, they're just all about wide, generous, touch-friendly spacing. And then you need to make like an admin screen, some sort of screen where information density is the most important thing. Like you can't use a design system that fundamentally does not believe in information density to make a system where some of the screens need high information density. And I wish I had a more concrete example of that. But
yeah, to plug my talk that Lance put in the chat a little while ago. Like I actually,
is that in the chat?
Yeah, I put it in our private chat because I wasn't sure if you wanted to have that shared. But
if you put it in the public one, then there's a button I can click that'll bring up the link on the screen here.
Okay, I will put that.
But yeah, there's I describe it as like you have to pick a design system that has the right analogy for the problem you're trying to solve.
Yeah,
that is the right analogy for the problem that you're trying to solve. Just as you have to pick a database that has the right features for the system you're trying to build. Like you can't just go say, I'm going to go decide and pick a random design system, and I'm going to go and pick a random set of features, and I'm just going to shove the two things together. Like that is a recipe for disaster. Like these design systems are oftentimes built with a set of apps in mind, or they're, like we discussed earlier, they're spawned from existing applications, and they are an embodiment of a visual language that's being used. And if your app doesn't speak that language, that fundamental kind of feature that you're trying to build isn't in alignment with that, then you're just going to have a bad time all the way around.
I remember an earlier version of this, earlier in our industry. At one point, each new version of Microsoft Office had a significantly new appearance with significantly new controls and interactions. Now, I think this was before the phrase design system was a thing, but there was definitely a sort of Microsoft design guidelines, and they would get advanced by a new version of Office being shipped. And so there was always like a delay there, like a new version of Office shipped, introducing a new vocabulary, a new visual vocabulary to the end users. But if you were back a generation of dev tools, it was exceedingly difficult to use that new vocabulary until your tools caught up. And there's no way you could have like had a generic layer built on in 1 year that encompassed ideas that hadn't even been thought until the following year. And there isn't like you can't make an abstraction that captures an innovation that hasn't happened yet, I guess is the idea. Is there anything like that in web or like in Angular material?
I think the density comes close.
Yeah.
Fundamentally, like it was the visual language that material itself was targeting was the analogy of physical objects, because you're going to be touching your phone. Like it was meant for mobile devices. It's undergone many changes since then, but Angular material itself is still based on that first design language that had that philosophy at the heart of it.
Yeah, I think like one of the things they iterated on in material, like added an idea of like a compact mode or something. Am I totally misremembering?
Yeah, no, it's the dense mode.
Dense mode. Okay, dense mode. Yeah. Okay, so if you're going to do some way of like doing runtime or whatever, skinning, let the designers do whatever, you'd have to decide whether your abstraction includes the idea of dense mode. And then if some of your implementations don't have a dense mode, it's really unclear how you could go back and plug that in, right? If it just doesn't exist.
Yep.
Interesting. So I was hoping somebody would say, "Oh, Kyle, there's this library you just haven't heard of yet that lets you do more like runtime runtime skinning on your Angular apps. And the closest I heard is Zachary saying that at the app level, his team had decided to sort of pre-wrap off-the-shelf components to make it easier to change your mind later.
Right.
I've heard that discussed many times. I don't think, like, I have definitely done that in older, different platforms. I've never done that in Angular.
I've done it twice now between 2 projects. My previous project, we were getting there just because we had developed our own system, just so we didn't have to have all these things everywhere. And then that got replaced with a separate team that had completely gone off the wall and done something not Angular. It was just a complete web elements implementation of a component library. So we brought that under the hood just so we could hook it up with Angular. And then current one is just, going from Angular material to an actual design system, making the components ourselves, but still having something from the get-go out of the box you can use and get the application going and getting some MVPs out and stuff like that. So.
Paul or Lance, have you ever done that?
I've done I made a dynamic form library.
Yeah.
And the way that operated was you specified, you gave it a JSON. It's like Formally, it's similar to Formally in the core of what it's about, but has several like key differences in terms of how it operates and the philosophy behind it. But you take a JSON object that represents the form you'd like to render, and one of the modes that it can operate in is it will allow you to specify a template that says, and here is how I would like you to lay out these controls. So not just, hey, I'd like to dynamically render them, but also here's how I would like it to dynamically show up on the page. The actual consumer of the form library, they get to specify what each individual category of control looks like, as well as how those flow onto the page. And so to achieve that, the core thing that was needed was a contract that you had to implement for the individual controls. So each control, you had an interface that you had to implement. That way you would know what kind of data you'd be receiving and what kind of events that you needed to emit in order to play your part in this larger scheme. But it gave you that flexibility of anyone could come along and write their own version of what it meant to be a select box and register that visual appearance, and then that visual appearance would be used by this library and dropped in wherever the flow template was instructed to drop that in. But that had the restriction of it could only do what the form library specified that it could do. Like that was that idea of a trade-off that I was talking about earlier about the no code, low code, is that flexibility had the cost of these things have to implement a very precise contract in order to work in this dynamic scheme.
So if you're willing to accept some of those constraints, do you think that some of the ideas in making that ultra dynamic form library could be used to make a like skinnable Angular component design system meta layer?
I think so. Like part of the idea was that library could very easily be extended into that low code solution I was describing earlier, because you have a layout engine, you have a way of specifying like here are some controls that I would like to be able to use. So if you were to like continue expanding out that set of controls, then in theory you could get to a point to where it was capable of building out a whole app where those controls were your themable, skinnable pieces.
And even to expand on that, like with our component library wrapper we didn't want to just wholesale change the entire API whenever we went to our design system versus Angular material. So like even having looked at some of the code that Paul was working on with that form thing, I think it's a good idea to possibly have that system where you have a generic API. This is what your system can do. This is what your component library can do. And then it's just about the wiring of here's a Angular material, or here's Bootstrap, or here's whatever. And then kind of just piecing it together per implementation could definitely work out, as long as you have that kind of uniform API that you're kind of set to, I guess, with your component library, whatever it is, to your form thing, your library.
So how different was your application level abstraction from like the Angular Material API in terms of like what properties and events came in and out of your components?
Not a ton. We try to be a little bit more generic with certain things because we didn't need some of the functionality for certain things, like maybe taking a table into account. Like for us, we never needed client-side sorting, client-side pagination, that kind of stuff. All of our stuff was always happening on the back end. That's just how we want it to be. So anytime any of those events triggered, we always just said, hey, our component library component, it has an event for when a sort changes and when a selection changes. Here's a few inputs you can do for giving us data. Here's a few inputs for like doing select versus multi-select, having actual sorting involved, stuff like that. And then that's it. It was super generic, super simple. There wasn't much to the component itself. There's a little bit more just from the view layer, just to make that a little bit more generic. But the actual like documentation API was very simple in terms of inputs and outputs. And we could kind of span that between like Angular Material and our design system without having to like redo everything. And because with our thing, we'd have to go through like, what is it? Upwards of like 7, 8 product apps, and they're constantly getting more. We'd have to go through all those, fix all of those if we made any API changes to our component library. So it's very much a thing where we want to keep it consistent as much as possible so we don't have to do extra work.
Yeah, that's great. We should totally do that for all of our customers. What else do we have to say about all this? Because I do have one other wrinkle in a totally different direction, but I don't want to divert until we're all the way out.
I'm kind of curious of what your thoughts are on this, reflecting back on previous technology waves.
So I think that in some ways, although a web platform is so much better than so much of what came before it, in some ways, it just hasn't caught up yet, because I feel like, we've had this conversation, like there are many apps that you still cannot build as quickly now as you could with Visual Basic, even though it was, incredibly primitive by today's standards. And I think that that's similarly true for some of the skinning stuff where, like, I think to get the level of adoption or to get adoption of that kind of skinnability, you'd almost need, you'd need it to be almost like a first-class citizen in your component library framework, instead of being something that only a few weirdos on a tech talk show in St. Louis are talking about. It would have to somehow, it's someday maybe the competitive sources of the marketplace would bring like first-class design system support, where like that's a feature accounted for in whatever future Angular competitor you're using. And I don't know exactly what it would look like, but basically there are kinds of features that if they're optional add-ons later, they can never truly be successful. They have to be first class from the first day to get certain capabilities and have them really become broadly successful. I don't know if we'll get there, but it does feel like in some of those ways we're maybe a little bit behind. Maybe we haven't really caught up to the peak of desktop dev before web arrived and washed it all away.
So what we really need is a spot framework that just only does component libraries and design systems, and then can marry that into like something else.
Well, I was thinking more along the lines of a library or framework that enforces from the first day in the design of the thing, like a hard boundary between the app behavior level and the component design level, and that somehow that boundary is therefore always there in all projects, instead of being something that is only occasionally created if you happen to have Zachary on your project.
Right. Well, I think that looks like to take it back to web specifically, I think what that looks like is a framework where when you say, I want a button to appear right here, you are truly saying, I want a framework button right here, not an HTML button.
Right. I want a button here, and then some other layer translates that to the tech.
Yeah, like Visual Basic was a great example of that. Like, you didn't have, Visual Basic wasn't built on top of HTML, so it need not concern itself with the idea of I have to provide the flexibility for an app author to be able to to go in and specify an exact HTML button that they can customize, and like that just wasn't a thing. Like by default, it had an opinion of like, I'm going to give you what Windows apps looks like.
Yeah.
And
I'm reminded of my Java days. I'm sure
Right.
Kyle will remember this, that the
Yeah.
first big UI toolkit for Java was called AWT. I don't remember what the A stood for, but our abstract windowing toolkit. I think.
It had abstract in the name, Lance. We don't even have that back.
Yeah, abstract windowing toolkit. And then they came out later with something that JFC pronounced swing, because obviously that's how those letters would be pronounced. And the big difference between AWT and swing is that AWT was heavyweight, meaning that when you used a button, it was the OS's button. But with swing, they called it lightweight, and they re-implemented them all from scratch, because they were just, the idea with Java was write once, run anywhere, and supporting all of the different idiosyncrasies of all the different platforms. Just they couldn't handle it after a while, and it was just better to go with the different approach. I have not thought in those terms in about a decade, but yeah, that was a big part of my life at one point.
So I built a company on that, grew and hired a team, and we built a huge amount of functionality on Swing. And like, I do understand why it's like kind of difficult to learn, but Swing was kind of ingenious in a way that we definitely haven't got back yet. And Lance, it's all about the thing you were saying about like you'd code Swing, and then you'd pick a look and feel, and it was like lightweight in the sense that it wasn't like bound to the platform you were running, and you'd radically change the appearance. And like Swing layout managers, people hated them. But like all the things that we're like fighting year after year after year in HTML, back in the Swing layout manager era, some really smart folks came up with some really great abstractions to where you could then plug in a layout manager. And if you were willing to step away from the layout managers in the box that were kind of hard to use, there were aftermarket layout managers that were just a joy. Like imagine CSS Grid, but turned up to 11.
Should I put links to form layout in the chat for this? Because that's totally what people coming to this conversation are looking for. Yeah, no,
I miss form layout so much, Lance.
Oh, I loved form layout. I never wanted to touch grid bag. Yeah, exactly. But
can we make a form layout for Angular?
I don't, because it's on the DOM. It's within the constraints of the DOM. I don't know that we could. And then there's also, with Angular, we're also going to iOS and Android and all the other different platforms besides the browser, which is what we think of 99% of the time. I'd love it.
Well, the native script, I guess, and then React Native, Vue Native, these all kind of take this idea of you write something that looks like HTML, but it gets rendered as native components on the platform you're running on. So like they're maybe a little bit closer to that idea that maybe, left bracket button is not concretely an HTML button. Maybe it's actually an abstraction of the idea of the button. And if I'm running on native script, it becomes a different kind of button. Now, I actually don't remember exactly how native script handles this, so don't take that as a native script tutorial.
I mean, it did remind me of like doing mobile development with Angular, or even just mobile development period, because I haven't done a lot of Java and C or that kind of H stuff. But yeah, it just kind of reminded me of doing like the like native script and things like that, just because you wrote stuff that kind of looked like HTML, but then it really wasn't. It was comparable to Angular because it had templates, but they weren't actual templates. And yeah, it was kind of neat to see that kind of just transcribed to everything.
So maybe some of this stuff is going to come back. Maybe if we're just a little bit patient, there'll be another wave, and it'll either have Swing-like abstractions, but maybe somehow round off some of the most difficult things to deal with in Swing. Maybe it'll ship with a layout manager that people don't hate. So I don't know. I believe in a better future, I guess is what I'm saying.
Yeah, and where I think about this a little bit, though, is Angular Material doesn't give us the straight select. It has a mat select, which is its own special thing.
Yeah.
And there's some good things about that, but if you try to work with the things that come built into Cypress for selects. Well, those aren't going to work because the area and the classes and all that are different. So you have to figure out how you're dealing with that. So just all of the tools that are built for web testing that know what the built-in things are, you're going to have to abstract those as well.
Yeah, I think that is the key challenge that we've not yet actually overcome, is the fact that unlike the Java idea where you were building on like everyone who had a different layout manager idea, like they were building on the same platform at the end of the day, despite having a different user implementation of their tools. Whereas here, like we can be talking about like an Angular version of this idea, and it will be wholly incompatible with the React Vue Svelte version of the same idea, and like the approach that they take to what it looks like to build this higher level abstraction. Like Zachary was talking about, like Zachary and Kyle were talking about like native script. Like their view of the world is wildly different from like other JavaScript verticals out there.
How about this, Paul? How about if you set aside the native script for a minute and React Native, but what if you built your Angular app on a set of web components, and those web components were like skinnable or substitutable? So then you define some single set of web components, and then so those are abstractions. We'll call this the Abstract Web Component Toolkit, AWT. Okay, and then your designers come in and produce whatever implementations of those components they want, concrete implementations that implement a specific design system. And so then regardless of whether you're using Angular, React, Vue, Svelte, whatever, as long as you're talking to that agreed vocabulary with the agreed properties and possible values and so on, then in theory your thing becomes more skinnable. Now you'd have to have some way of handling layout, like a layout component. But I can imagine having a layout component that then like abstractly describes which layout I want, and then.
Well, I've seen a tool like Golden Layout. It is
it's pretty cool.
It's a pre-SPA tool.
Yeah.
And it is kind of it is essentially a layout manager for the web. But there are like the way the JavaScript in it operates and the assumptions it makes about like what goes into an app are fundamentally different from these other verticals of like the idea of SPA and component-based development.
I wonder if you could implement something like Golden Layout, but as a web component with content projection slots, so that it kind of fit the grain, and then you could use it from within Angular and React and so on, and it would feel okay. Keep in mind that I've never actually built a thing with Golden Layout, so the answer is probably no, Kyle. You're crazy. And now I'm just brimming with ideas. Anybody want to take a year off from implementing our customer projects and go implement an abstract web component toolkit?
I'd like nothing more.
Counts on Kevin.
It might be difficult to pull off. I don't know.
And then we'll do JavaScript Foundation classes. We'll pronounce that swung.
I love it. Like, or maybe what was swing named after? Was it like named after the musical genre? Can we just pick some different musical genre and name our new implementation off of that?
I have no idea.
Just do rave. Be fine.
Right, there you go. We'll call, our new one is called Rave. It replaces swing. It's very, very new. I need to stop this bright sunlight from hitting me straight in the face when I'm sitting here. Anyway, I guess it seems like we've kind of beat this dead horse, so to speak, as far as one possibly could. No aspersion to horses implied, of course. We had a possible second big topic, but I think that's probably out. So I guess all that's left is the some that was written in our pitch here was there's actually two different meanings I've heard of Angular for designers, right? And the first one is one we've talked about. It's like, how does that boundary work between your designers and your developers? But the other way I've heard that phrase used, and I think it was by I'm I don't remember. I don't want to misquote somebody. That some well-known Angular person making courses that you could go and get. I don't know if they were free or paid, but their idea, their interpretation of that same phrase was, here is Angular presented and taught in a carefully crafted way to make an easy on-ramp for people that are designers to move toward Angular development. So it's it's a completely different meaning to the phrase Angular for designers. And of course, everyone here has taught many people Angular. I'm curious, do we have any thoughts or insights on how and whether Angular might be a good on-ramp? Or is that just sort of like it's one choice among many? A designer is just as well off learning React first, or Vue, or Svelte, or jQuery, or Visual Basic?
Yeah, I don't have a good answer to that one. As I said, I've had some classes where designers have learned it really easily, but I don't know that there was anything that I would have done to cater the class to her skill sets or her knowledge or her background. Or, I don't know that I know enough about what a designer would specifically want to learn and what their background is to be able to say this is how we would adjust our curriculum, or even whether. And there's contents of curriculum, and then there's also the style of teaching. There's a lot of different vectors upon which we could change things.
Well, since Lance just said that Angular Bootcamp actually already works great for designers, I went ahead and put the URL up on the screen here.
Those are the exact words, yes.
Well, that was what I got, is that you've had designers in Angular Bootcamp, and it worked very well for them, which I of course, am thrilled to hear that.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think, Lance, the key thing that came to mind when you were saying that is that why are they wanting to learn it? Like, what is the motivation for the designer to make the gap? Are they trying to do a career change? Are they trying to pivot within their org? Are they just simply wanting to supplement their knowledge to have a better working relationship with the developers on their team? Like, what is their motivation? Because much like I said earlier, like there's Angular for app developers and Angular for library authors. Like, I honestly feel that there's a third category that is Angular for designers, that like there's a different subset of this tool that's most important for you to know, but it kind of depends on why you are coming to this world and from what angle.
Yeah, and I would guess that the one person I'm thinking of isn't the only designer who's gone through our class. We've probably had quite a few, but I would guess that most of them came through like that one example I'm thinking of, where the whole team was there. So it wasn't just developers. There were managers, and there were database administrators, and there were the designer. And so it was kind of, let's get everyone on the team to have some understanding of what's going on here. There were QA people as well. I doubt that we've ever had many people sign up for our public classes as just I'm here without a team. I'm the one person who's a designer, unless they were looking for a job switch. I could be wrong, but that's just would be where I would guess.
And from my perspective, I don't think Angular, like as I've gone more towards classic CSS, like raw CSS and form of projects, so stepping away from just doing component specific styles that are kind of hard to override and things like that, I feel like Angular doesn't, like, it still brings a lot to the table, obviously, like it's everything in the toolbox type of thing. But from a designer perspective, like it's just CSS at the end of the day that they're probably looking more towards, unless they're trying to do like a job pivot or something like that. So there's nothing particularly special in terms of the frameworks where it's just CSS. And if you're doing raw global CSS, then that's where you're at. And since I've kind of stepped away from doing like low level component specific styles and gone more of the global styles, like the raw, normal HTML, CSS kind of path, I've kind of seen that kind of just take fruition, where you don't really need Angular specifically if you're a designer. It doesn't matter too much at the end of the day.
Well, I agree with all that. So are we at the wrap-up point? Are we? Paul, you
Seems
thought I saw Paul unmute. I don't want to cut anybody off.
I think we've hit the main points on this one.
Yeah. Okay. Well, I guess great talking with everybody here today. Hopefully, some viewers out there on YouTube's 10 billion videos or whatever find ours and get some value out of it. And I guess I'll see some people in a couple weeks to do this all again on a different topic.
Sounds good.
Yeah. Bye bye, everybody.